Capital is abundant. Understanding is scarce. The Dynamo Show goes deep with the new industrialists rejuvenating industry and commerce. Brought to you by Dynamo Ventures. Learn more at dynamo.vc/podcast. Now, here's your host, Madelyn O'Farrell.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Madelyn O'Farrell, and we're joined today by Didi Caldwell, the President and CEO of Global Location Strategies. Didi, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
To start us off, I'd love if you could just give a little bit of background on Global Location Strategies, what it is you guys practically do every day.
So our purpose is really to support economics prosperity. And the way that we do that is through the art and science of company and community matchmaking. So what that really means is that we're a boutique management consulting firm that focuses on location strategy, particularly for capital intensive, resource intensive, and labor intensive projects. So think things like advanced manufacturing, data centers, power generation, these types of facilities that require lots of utilities, human talent, the right location, logistics, et cetera.
And before we get further into all of that good stuff, tell us more about you and how you got into this space.
Well, it was really quite by accident. My undergraduate's in architecture, and then I did my international MBA, and I was working for a large engineering and construction firm in Argentina in 1997 when I met someone who is a pioneer in this space, Ed McCallum. And when he told me what he was doing, and I said, wait a minute, you get to fly all over the world advising companies on where they should build their next manufacturing facility. And he said, yes. And I said, and they pay you to do that. I said, please give me a job. I will do it for free. Having no idea what I was getting into, but it just sounded like it brought all together all of the things that I really enjoyed. And I worked for Fluor for many years, and then I started my own company in 2008, and we've been off to the races since then.
Amazing. One thing that you said is that site selection is not just a real estate choice, it's a core supply chain decision. What are some of the misconceptions that companies still have around site selection?
I think one of the big things is that they let incentives have an outsize importance in the decision making. Like, sometimes we have clients that say, we should go to this location because I hear they have great incentives. But incentives are really about enhancing a location that's already fundamentally good for your location. So they cannot make a bad location good. They can only make a good location better. So that's one of them. I think one of the things is that they just don't give themselves enough time. The process of finding the right location is really not something that should be rushed. And so if you're thinking that you're going to find a location for your new manufacturing facility in a couple of months, you're going to have to sacrifice the thoroughness of a rigid analysis. If you give yourself somewhere, 6 months to a year, I would say that that's probably a really good time frame. And understanding the labor market. That's another thing that I think sometimes is enough emphasis is not put on that. We have a lot of data. We evaluate communities by interviewing existing employers and really listening to what they say and listening for the cues, not just what the data says, but also what can you read between the lines of what the employers are saying to really understand what that labor market. And if you skip that part of talking to the people that are on the ground, then you've missed at least 50% of the story.
Oh, interesting. On that point around, assessing the labor dynamics, what are some of the other vectors that you're judging to assess whether a site is good versus bad?
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be very specific to the company and to the specific project. However, on the cost side, at least for manufacturers, there are three main drivers, and that is energy, labor, and logistics. And how important one is, or the weight that one of those carries relative to the others, is going to be very specific to the project. So helping triangulate on where the lowest cost location is, but we don't just want to go to the lowest cost. We also want to go to the highest quality location. So understanding that trade-off between cost and quality. And then the third dimension is really risk. So we may estimate that it's going to cost one thing, we may understand that the workforce looks like it does, but what does it look like moving forward? What are their risks to their budget, their schedule, or their ability to permit, construct, commission, and operate that facility well into the future and maybe even expand? And when you look at the trade-offs of all of those three things, cost, quality, and risk, then they can make a really informed decision. I mean, I would love to say that we can find the perfect location that is the highest quality, the lowest cost, and the least risk. But like in many things in life, you often have to make trade-offs. So our process is very data-driven to help them understand exactly what those trade-offs are. So then we go to work on the negotiations and the due diligence to help mitigate any risks or weaknesses that we found during that analysis.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, given some of the topics we've been covering in this podcast recently around tariffs, the rewiring of supply chain, labor shortages, how do those dynamics affect how manufacturers are thinking about where to build?
Yeah, one of the things is, the ground has really shifted immensely under the feet of manufacturers over the last few years. It really started with COVID. That was a huge supply chain shock. But we've also had, armed conflict in Europe for the first time since World War II. We've also got Liberation Day with the tariffs, which seem to change on a regular basis. We have export controls from places like China where they're threatening not to export the rare earth magnets that we need that go in just about everything. So companies are now looking for resilience. I would posit that the risk premium for extended global supply chains was underpriced for decades. And it was all about chasing the lowest cost of production. And there wasn't very much emphasis on the risk of each interconnected link in that supply chain. And starting with COVID, but moving forward to where we are today, that risk has really shown its head and how much it can really impact entire manufacturing supply chains. And so the focus now is on understanding the risk, scenario planning, looking at what is the best and the worst case scenario and the most likely scenario so that they can make an informed decision that even if the worst case scenario happens, they have resiliency in their supply chain so that they can continue to operate.
What are some other ways that they're actually managing that risk? You've talked a little bit about kind of the upfront assessment. Are there things that happen further into the process as well around that risk mitigation?
Well, it depends on what type of risk it is. So, for example, if it's something associated with environmental risk, then doing really during the due diligence phase, making sure that all of your studies are up to date, that your archaeological, cultural, endangered species, wetlands, all of those have been covered. So, sometimes it's just by doing additional due diligence on the front end. Sometimes it's more operational and it's not necessarily a site selection decision, but if you have a single source supplier, that may or may not be easier to find a secondary source in certain locations. But even if you find yourself in a location that's disadvantaged, it's still worth going through the exercise of setting up a secondary source of supply. Getting commitments from utility providers of, when they're going to be able to be in service and holding their feet to the fire on, making sure that whenever they're ready to commission the plant, that they have the utilities that they need to the site. So it's a whole process that you go through. I mean, there are also things like, bonded warehouses and foreign trade zones, which depending on which side of the tariff battle you're on, one of those may work for you. I mean, I used to look at foreign trade zones when I started in site selection 28 years ago, but then they fell out of favor pretty much because there's additional administrative cost associated with them. And we were in a low tariff environment. Now that we're in a high tariff environment or an unstable tariff environment, foreign trade zones are starting to look interesting again, but they still haven't really come back in quite the force that I might have thought they would over the last year.
For the benefit of our listeners, could you tell us a little bit more about what a foreign trade zone actually is?
So a foreign trade zone is a place where you can import goods and without paying a tariff. You can do value add at that location, and then when you bring it in, you're not paying all of the duty on the total value. It's only on the part that was imported. You can also do the value add in the United States and ship that product out to a third location without paying tariffs at all. So it's really a protection from having sometimes double tariffs. So if you think about products that go back and forth across the Mexican and U.S. border multiple times, it could protect from double tariffs being applied. But it's also the ability to protect and to provide you more time before you have to pay that tariff. Bonded warehouses work similarly as well. The big difference is what tariff rate is in effect, whether you ship the tariff where you ship, the date that you shipped, or the date that you received and send it out of the foreign trade zone or the bonded warehouse. That's the biggest difference in those two.
That's really helpful. Appreciate that. One of the things you mentioned earlier is one of the kind of key considerations is logistics when choosing a site. I'm curious, given some of the congestion and volatility we've seen around the logistics environment the last few years, how is that affecting site selection for your clients?
Well, I think that, we're really looking for multimodal redundancy. So there's no single point of failure. So, I mean, that can go all the way down to the site level where you're looking for more than one entrance and exit, but you also might be looking for additional highway routes. We're looking at being able to ship by rail, be that direct service, a transload facility, or intermodal, or sometimes even in marine situations. So some of my projects require marine service. So if you are transporting some type of raw material that can go by rail, but also by barge, by having both of those alternatives, then you reduce some of your risk. And I talked already about having proximity to more than one tier one suppliers and customers, so that you're anytime you reduce the distance and the barriers to being able to receive or send product, then you're lowering the risk associated with that. And things like investment in inland ports and intermodal hubs have really helped companies take advantage of those multimodal opportunities. Because if transportation stops, and everything stops. So companies are building resilience into that map itself, and we saw that during COVID when the port shut down. It was just impossible to get anything done. So they're really trying to do whatever they can to avoid that going forward.
That makes a lot of sense. I know that you work with a number of clients across food and pharma and metals and a number of other sectors. Are you identifying any sector-specific trends emerging across these different groups?
I would say that, energy availability impacts all of those groups because, the AI data centers are so energy hungry that they're just hoovering up available land, available energy. And so it's getting harder and harder for cost-sensitive industries like manufacturing to find land at a reasonable price, to find available electricity at a reasonable price. That more impacts larger, more complex, energy-intensive projects like metals, but it has a broad application as well. For automotive and EV, I mean, certainly we've got an administration shift associated with electric vehicles and clean energy in general, and green technology, as well as the tariffs. The tariffs have really hurt the automotive industry. So we don't see really big announcements being made right now until we better understand the lay of the land. There's also, recently, I think the administration just released that they're going to suspend or lighten the mileage requirements, the fuel efficiency requirements on cars that were supposed to take effect, I think, in 2030. So it'd be interesting to see what happens to these companies like Ford and GM and others that have invested heavily in electric vehicles if they no longer have to meet this requirement. Pharma and biologics, I mean, it's all about national security. So we found out also during COVID that we were very exposed for certain pharmaceuticals, but also for the reagents that are used in the pharmaceuticals. A lot of that supply comes out of China and India. And in a global supply shock or in a national security crisis, that's not a very good position to be in. So that's driving a lot of that. But then they have this huge constraint associated with labor. clean room environment, the skills that are required in pharmaceuticals and biologics are just unique, and we don't have nearly enough of them. I mean, across all sectors, we're seeing really constrained availability of skilled workforce. And we're not making things any better because we're deporting a large portion of our immigrants, undocumented immigrants, but even immigrants that have documents are sometimes afraid to go to work. So it's really impacting the construction, the manufacturing, and the agricultural sectors more than any.
Yeah, we do see reduced migration as a headwind to kind of the reindustrialization effort that the U.S. is attempting to undertake right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Looking ahead, what are some of the early signals that supply chain leaders should be looking to as far as what will shape manufacturing location strategy in the coming decade?
Well, I think there's this demographic cliff. The oldest baby boomers now, or the youngest baby boomers, have reached retirement age, and the Gen X cohort, of which I'm a part of, is a much smaller cohort. And so, even though the millennials are coming behind, and they're also a very large cohort, they just don't have the skills that the baby boomers had. And so, that declining working age population, not just in the U.S., it's pretty much a global problem. But 95% of our increase in the workforce in general has been attributable to immigration over the last 10 or so years. So if we're going to cut that off, then we're making it even worse for ourselves. But really replacing those baby boomer skills and just bodies is going to be a 20-year effort. Grid transformation. I mean, we need to at least grow our grid generation by somewhere between 50 and 100%. So that's like up to another 2.6 gigawatts. So if you think about, having 2,600, decent sized nuclear power plants at 1,000 megawatts apiece, then that's what's going to be required. So, and it's not just the generation; it's also the transmission. So Texas is building a 765 kilovolt line that is a backbone between the Permian and the where they have all the natural gas, and the Texas Triangle where all the demand is. And so they are getting ahead of this, or maybe not getting ahead, but at least catching up. The rest of the country also needs to do that. Water stress is a big deal for us. So it's, water is very local. You either have it or you don't. And in places that don't have it, particularly in the western part of the country, it's shaping where food, metals, and semiconductor locations can actually happen. And I don't want to paint everything with a broad brush, because it doesn't mean that just because you're in a desert doesn't mean you don't have water. But there is a lot of competition for water. There's competition with other industries. There's competition for growing residential areas, and there's competition for agriculture. So we see that right now, particularly Corpus Christi is probably the poster child for that. They dedicated a lot of their water resources to the industry there, the ethane crackers and other chemical operations, and now they're having to build a desalination plant. And then something that's, emerging, and I don't really know how it's going to turn out, is these AI-driven supply chains. So predictive demand planning and resilience modeling, and this is going to change how companies evaluate risk. And we're just starting to see the potential there. And so I'm really curious to see how that's going to start transforming the way that companies make the decisions. I don't have the answer yet. But the companies that pay attention to these signals now are going to make smarter bets in the coming years, especially going into the 2030s.
Certainly agree with all the above, and appreciate your insights there. As a last little bit here is our rapid fire section. I'll just throw a couple quick, questions at you and just get your kind of gut reaction to them. First one is, what do you think is the most underrated city or region for manufacturing right now?
I think I would say the Mississippi River corridor. And that's not just specific to Mississippi. But, because of the Jones Act, we've virtually eliminated the majority of the shipping that happens on the U.S. waterways. And it's a highly underutilized resource. There's so much opportunity, not just for transportation, but also to address that water issue that we're talking about. if you're located in close proximity to the Mississippi River. And I would say the same thing is true for the Ohio River as well.
Oh, interesting. In one word, what do you think describes site selection in 2025?
That's a good one. A few years ago, I would have used the word chaotic. I think I would use the word persistent now. So I feel like we reached a fever pitch probably in 2021, 22. And that has definitely calmed down. And the tariffs threw a bit of water on the fire. But companies are emerging from that. They know that they're going to have to make decisions. And so we still see relatively high activity levels, even if decision making is slow. But I see more of like a persistent grind as opposed to a fevered pitch or a complete slowdown.
Amazing. What is the wildest assumption a company has ever brought to you for a site search project?
It's probably a combination of things, and it's all around energy. Companies, particularly over the last few years, they've sort of, tampered their expectations recently. But, for a while there, it was all driven by, this quest to be as green as possible, which was also driven by the IRA money. But they wanted hundreds of megawatts of power. They wanted it immediately. They wanted it to be carbon free. They preferred that it be adjacent to them so that, it was really clear that these are where my electrons are coming from. And they wanted it at 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And, it's like the purple unicorn. I mean, that just doesn't exist. And so I even had one client one time that told me that he needed 8 gigawatts of power and he wanted it carbon free. And I'm like, do you know how much 8 gigawatts is? And finally he looked it up and he says, oh, that's 4 Hoover dams. I said, yes, that's right. So he had his calculations wrong. It was a much smaller number. But nonetheless, his expectations were completely unrealistic. Now I think that, particularly with the data centers, hyperscalers and things like that, they just want a path to carbon free, but with the understanding that we're still going to have an all of the above strategy to meet our energy needs going forward, or we will not be able to realize the reindustrialization goals that we have.
Definitely agree. And it's been interesting to see kind of the old forms of energy that weren't getting as much love in prior decades kind of come back to the forefront, i.e. nuclear is the one that, I think comes to mind for many, and the way that the hyperscalers are driving a lot of that demand.
Yes.
A fun one for you here at the end. What's the best piece of advice you give manufacturers that they rarely follow?
I would say that there's 2 types of companies. The ones that really understand how complex and consequential this decision is. These are generational decisions and it's not something to be taken lightly. And so you don't necessarily have to hire a site selection consultant, although of course I would give that advice. But you do need somebody, whether it's internally or externally in your organization, that has the skill and the time to be able to dedicate to doing a thorough analysis where you look at all of your alternatives, you understand what your project needs, you restrict it to only the ones that can pass that fatal flaw analysis, and then you do that thorough analysis of cost, quality, and risk before you even begin to think about incentives. The other type of company is ones that think they can do it themselves, or they hire somebody that's not really qualified. Maybe they're qualified technically, maybe they're qualified when it comes to incentives only, maybe they're qualified when it comes to a real estate transaction, but they don't have the whole picture. And, I say that I'm an inch deep and a mile wide. And some people say, well, you're not giving yourself enough credit. And so I say, okay, I'm an inch deep and 2 miles wide, because the variety of aspects that we have to look at to make sure that this location will be a success for our client is extremely broad. And any one of those things can destroy your business plan. And so I would say that many companies do follow this advice, but there's a lot of people that are doing it themselves and maybe well, I like to park my yacht in Charleston, so I want to put my manufacturing facility in the Charleston region. That might be great for you, but that doesn't mean that it's best for the business. So hopefully they will follow my advice more to have, an expert looking at their site selection decision.
Definitely fair. Well, Didi, that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a 5-star review and tell us what you liked. And be sure to head over to podcast.dynamo.vc to keep up to date with our latest content, or subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. Until next time.